best he could for Paul, perhaps he shared this with the centurion and said, look, he's not going to be the kind that's going to escape. He's not going to be the kind to jeopardize you or anyone else. Treat him courteously. And that's exactly what Julius did. Now, did that actually happen? Don't know. It's just speculation at this point. But what we do know is that he gave him liberty. That's what we know. Incidentally, the word courteously in the Greek means philanthropos, which from we get the word what? Philanthropy, yeah. And he gave him liberty to go to his friends and refresh himself. And in Sidon, apparently there was a church. The believers were called friends. Get a hold of that. In this church, a believer was called friend. And that really shouldn't come as any shock to anybody. Why? Remember John 15:15, where Jesus said, no longer will I call you servants. What? I call you friends. And one of the terms that was commonly used for a designation of Christians in that day was friends. And there was a church founded in Sidon, most likely founded in the repercussions of the persecution of Stephen. You'll remember that. So you'll remember back in the early part of the book of Acts, when the persecution broke out against Stephen, the church was scattered, and the scattering of the church, Judea and Samaria, was pretty well evangelized. And apparently a church was begun in the area of Sidon. Now, what did he do when he went there, and why did he go? What did Paul do when he went there, and why did he go? Well, I'm sure he went there for the fellowship of the believers. I mean, I can buy that. Because he loved that, right? Paul loved that. And I'm sure he did some teaching. We see that routinely with Paul, right? In every opportunity he's teaching. I'm sure he did some ministering, because that's the nature of the man, Paul. You couldn't restrain Paul from ministering. He was too committed to those things. But it says here, and this is an interesting word, to refresh himself. Now that's interesting if you look at the meaning of the word. In the Greek, what does the word refresh mean? It's actually a medical term. And it has to do with medical care to indicate when someone's sick. Now the plot thickens, doesn't it? And it isn't really, do we really think it's any wonder with all that this man has endured in the time since his liberty, having been a prisoner now for about 2 years? And so in his illness, he's probably not able to gain the diet that's needed to maintain optimal health and rest, right? And the care that he's needed to board this ship. And now he's on this ship. And Julius allows him the privilege of going with other Christians who minister to him equally as he ministers to them spiritually. Verse 4. And when he had launched from thence, we sailed under Cyprus because the winds were contrary. Now, normally they would not go this way around Cyprus, of course. We're talking about a coasting vessel here. You wouldn't dare venture into open seas with any kind of a wind problem. Okay, so they coasted around the coast there because the winds were very agreeable, and that's what this ship was really designed to do. Verse 5, and when he had sailed over the sea of Cilicia, I forget, I used to pronounce this right, and Pamphylia, they came to Myra, the city in Lycia. Verse 6, where the centurion found the ship of Alexandria sailing into Italy, and he put us therein. So they arrive in this place, and there it happened to be one of the grain ships there in the harbor, and they realize the opportunity to transfer ships and catch a ship that's going to Rome. And verse 7, and when he had sailed slowly many days and scarce were come over against Cnidus, the wind not suffering us, we sailed under Crete over against Salome. And they had passed Cnidus, of course, immediately when they did this, They left the shelter of land. What do you get with land when you stay close to land? You get break from the wind, right? The gentle land winds, as they call them, they ceased. So the protection ceased and the wind became extremely strong as they ventured immediately into open sea, and they were unable to harbor at Cnidus. They could not direct the ship into the harbor, so they had to let it go. Okay? They couldn't handle the wind. And they did what they did, and what they did was they ran smack into the prevailing winds that plunged them right into the pressing, pummeling waters, and they couldn't handle it. And you'll notice the only thing they could do was just let it go, to try to get the ship down around the underside of Crete in order to be able to hide from the wind and to have some kind of break from this tremendous wind that was blowing. So in verse 8, and hardly passing it, came into a place which was called the Fair Havens. Really a misnomer when you find out about it. The Fair Havens, nigh whereunto was the city of Lasea. And it was tough. This is difficult. And difficult really doesn't begin to describe what they're experiencing here. Crete is a 140-mile long island. And they just wanted to turn the edge and get into the harbor. And with great difficulty, they finally make it to a place called Calais Limenis, which is Greek for fair haven, near to which the city of Lasea rested. Now look at verse 9. And when much time was spent, and when sailing was now dangerous because the fast was now already past, Paul admonished them. Now, if they got there sometime at the end of August, and a month passed, the notion that Luke gives us here is that we are now into the fall, and that's a very dangerous time to sail. They're in a period of time when sailing's very dangerous, and because the fast had already passed, the fast is referenced as what? That's the Day of Atonement. That's Yom Kippur. And the Jewish fast, which took place in late September or early October. So if the fast is now passed, we're talking post-October, which means what in the weather world for these folks? Well, yeah, to put it mildly, but in terms of weather, there's the word. There it is. And apparently a period of time where weather turns from fair to dire in open water. Look at verse 10. And he said to them, Sirs, I perceive, this is Paul speaking, Sirs, I perceive that this voyage will be with hurt and much damage, not only of the lading of the ship, but also our lives. And Paul's just giving them a little bit of practical advice here. Is Paul a sailor? No. Oh, he does have a lot of experience. He's been through how many shipwrecks at this point? 3. And he's not looking forward to a 4th. So he's trying to help here. And remember what we said about a leader, right? Okay, so just remember that. Keep the word leader in your mind as you hear Paul as we go forward here. And he says, guys, this is not going to happen without some real violence or damage to the cargo, the ship, and possibly our lives. He doesn't say they're going to die. He just says there's going to be some violence and there's going to be some damage. And this is a practical man. And we find here another quality of a leader. A leader not only is loved by people, but you see here another quality of a leader is that he speaks what needs to be said. I think there's a Sunday school lesson in there somewhere. A leader says what has to be said. He's practical, and since he wasn't anybody who supposedly was in control or knew anything about sailing, look at the response in verse 11. Nevertheless, the centurion believed the master and the owner of the ship more than those things which were spoken of by Paul. Was that smart? Well, you would think you'd be able to go to a shipmaster and get the straight scoop, okay? So that really doesn't surprise me, but they're going to regret that. Verse 13, and when the south wind blew softly, supposing that they had obtained their purpose, loosing thence they sailed close by Crete. So they're hugging the coast again, right? We're talking about these calm, gentle land winds. Beware, folks. Look at verse 14. This is where things change dramatically. But not long after there arose against it a tempest wind called Eurosidon or Slidon. That was a sailor's term for what we know as a nor'easter. Everybody heard the term nor'easter? Everybody knows what that is. It comes from two words, one Greek, one Latin. The Greek word is euros, and it means east wind. The Latin word is aquilo, and it means north wind. Euroslidon. And because it was so fierce, it was one of the greatest feared winds of all, and it was the wind of a hurricane or a typhoon. It had that type of proportion. So another way to say this is they were in the equivalent of a hurricane. And the boat was like a pod floating on the ocean, bobbing up and down and being pummeled and beaten by this northeast wind. And it was a hurricane or a typhoon with all the concurrent airflow that comes together and swirls the clouds and swirls the seas, and they were in the midst of it. And whenever the northeastern wind blow, it would come in these hurricane or typhoon dimensions, and it would blast the ship into something known as the Greater Syrtis. The Greater Syrtis are sandbanks off the northern coast of Africa. And they've been regarded as a source of danger to mariners. In fact, this region is known as the graveyard of mariners. Okay? I've got a book in my library at home called The Graveyard of the Atlantic. Anybody know where the graveyard of the Atlantic is?
Is it Bermuda?
North Carolina coast. Ruby is spot on. Outer Banks, Nag's Head, Kitty Hawk, Graveyard of the Atlantic. It's a fascinating book. So what would happen was it would reef them and it would shatter them on the Greater Syrtis, and lives would be lost on the coast of North Africa. And so they're afraid of that. Every mariner knows this. So they are afraid that's what's about to happen. And rightly so, because that's what routinely happens. So they had two options. If the hurricane didn't dump them into the sea and capsize the ship, then the hurricane would drive them into the graveyard of ships known as the Greater Syrtis. Well, verse 15 tells us what happened. When the ship was caught and couldn't bear up into the wind, they let her drive. In other words, it didn't capsize the ship, but it began to drive her into the sea. And it began to drive her south in the power of the wind blowing from the northeast, and it began to drive south and west, and they just had to let it go. 23 miles from Fairhaven, where they had started, was the small little island of Cauda. Look at verse 16. And running under the certain island, which is called Clauda, we had much work to come by the boat. And it's mentioned here as Clauda with an L, but some call it Cauda, and today it's known by the Italians as Gazzo. And somebody said, oh, maybe you've been there. In case you ever have the occasion to go, you'll know what happened there by this Sunday school lesson. It's also called Gavdos. Gavdos, Gavdos, or Gavdos. So in verse 16, it also says, we had much work to come by the boat. That refers to securing the skiff or the dinghy. Okay? So when you get into a hurricane, you're in a single mast vessel. There's no distribution of stress, and that's in a multi-sailed vessel. The stress is distributed over the entire hull. Not so in the boat they're in. In a single mast situation, the stress is directed at one area where it begins to split the ship. And it will literally splinter the entire hull unless something is done. So what they tried to do, what was sometimes successful, sometimes not, they would wrap the hull in the ship with rope. Just wrap it up, the entire hull. And they would winch it as tight as they could get it in order to what? Hold the ship together. Now remember, they're not building ships with bolts and steel beams and such and with rivets. How are they constructing ships in that day? What? Pegs? They're slapping these boards together and they're held together by something called pitch. There's not a lot holding that bolt together is what I'm trying to tell you. And so the only way that they would have any chance of keeping the boat together was to put these cables or these straps or these ropes, and they would say they would frap the ship. That's what it means, to undergird the ship. Verse 17, and when they had taken it up, and when they had taken up, they used helps undergirding the ship, there it is, and fearing lest they should fall into the quicksands, strake sail, and so were driven. So it mentions the quicksands. That's really the Syrtis that we talked about, that area. It can be translated reef, shoal, or sandbar, or sandy beach. It's that area of Greater Syrtis that I talked about. And it points to dropping the mainsail. It talks about strake or struck the sail. And that what that literally means in the Greek is to lower the gear. And now we're talking about dropping the sail. And it worked. It worked, not just because they dropped the sail, but what other reason did this measure work? Not a trick question. God's in control. God is directing every jot and tittle of everything that's happening. He's in total control here. And if you want to know something amazing, Melita is a small island that's Malta today. Isn't it interesting that with this sail down and the storm swirling about them, and in verse 20, the inability to see stars for clouds, they couldn't see day or night, which means what? They can't navigate. They don't know where they're at. They have no way of stirring. Isn't it interesting that they find their way into that harbor? And all of this is the plan of God. That's not by happenstance, folks, and we're going to see that in a minute. They're in real trouble here. They're afraid. They need something. So here comes Paul. And this time God says, all right, my man, it's your time. It's your time, Paul. In modern vernacular, we might say, you've got the ball, Paul. Time to run with it. And does he? Let's establish who's who here, and then we've got a foundation for presenting the gospel. Look at verse 18. And we being exceedingly tossed with tempest, that means typhoon or hurricane, the next day they lightened the ship. Well, that means they did what? They're dumping stuff overboard, okay, in an effort to save their lives. Some of it, not all of it. They would keep some of the food and some of the cargo for ballast, because you got to balance the ship. Some of it for their own food, and hopefully enough to get to Rome so they wouldn't lose it all. And in verse 19, the third day, we cast out with our own hands the tackling. What's the tackling? Yeah, that's what I thought. Tackling is not ropes and other gear. Tackling is baggage, their own bags. They were throwing their bags, their personal belongings, overboard. They were jettisoning their own cargo, their own stuff. Verse 20 says, and when neither sun nor stars in many days appeared, and no small tempest lay on us, all hope that we should be saved was taken away. Boy, it's a hard thing when you lose hope, right? In any area of life. But on this ship, it seemed really bad, and they just said, hey, you know what? We're going to die. They've lost all hope. Totally lost hope. And God said, that's exactly what I want. That's exactly what I want. No one has any assurance. No one has any hope. No one can turn to anybody or anything. You are hopeless. And folks, isn't that true of our condition when we're without Christ? We are hopeless. Now, for time's sake, I've got to rush ahead. God is announcing His presence, and I think this is beautiful. One of the principles that God has used over and over in His Word comes in response to man's absolute hopelessness. Right? Isn't that right? So here he announces who he is. And he had just the man to do it in Paul. Look at verse 21. And after long abstinence and after long without food, and incidentally, they were long without food. Why? How do we know that? How do we know they were long without food? Well, they were throwing food overboard. We know that, right? But have you ever been seasick? You know what that's like? The sickest I've ever been was on a boat. It was a fishing boat. We had 20-foot sails. We were going up and down, up and down. And let me tell you, I have never been so glad to see dry land than I was that day. It's the sickest I have ever been. Just imagine what these men were going through. And of course, in addition, they probably had some pretty salty food with the water washing over the decks and maybe affecting some of the food. And so without food, Paul stood in the midst of them and says, "Sirs," and I love this, you know Paul is human, right? Like we all are. He couldn't resist it. Look at verse 21. "Sirs, you should have hearkened unto me and not have loosed from Crete, and to have gained this harm and loss." In other words, what? You should have listened to me. I told you so. Now, why is he saying that? Why is Paul saying that? Because he has to establish the fact that he knows what he's talking about. This is the beginning of the establishment of the credibility of Paul as God's man. Now watch verse 22 quickly. "And now I exhort you, be of good cheer." And I can just see some of these men with this boat being thrown and tossed about. Maybe some of them are hanging on to the mast. And Paul stands up in the middle of them and says, "Cheer up, fellas. There's no reason to fear. For there shall be no loss of any man's life among you, only the ship." Now that's terrific, folks. Why would they believe him? Because he was right before. So God is establishing the credibility of Paul in this circumstance. And you see how God set up the credibility because he was right once. The foundation is there. And look at verse 23. "For there stood by me this night an angel of God," and I love this, "whose I am and whom I serve." Don't you love that? And folks, we are just about out of time, so I think we can pause here. But listen, when the storms of life blow, we can make spiritual application here. I know this is an actual event. We're talking about physical harm, and we're talking about an actual ship. But aren't we on the ship of life? Aren't we on open waters? And don't we encounter storms in our life? Isn't it comforting to know? I mean, the words of Paul here, don't they ring true? The God that I serve. The God who I serve. Whose I am. It's who I am. A Christian is who I am. From every fiber of my being now that I've given Christ my life, it is who I am. Everything I do is filtered through that. Right? Right? That's right. That's right. Whom I serve. I know who my God is. And I know what my God's capable of. That's where Paul was. That's exactly where he was. Now, we're out of time. I just want to say, and we'll wrap up with this. It seems fairly certain, if you know the story of Paul, and this is just to close out the series. Paul makes it to Rome. We know that. If you go to the next chapter, you'll see that. Tradition says Paul spent 2 years in prison, and during that time, he wrote Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, Philemon, and then it's thought that after 2 years, Paul had his audience with Caesar, and it's generally accepted, even though we don't have this firmly recorded in the Bible, it's generally accepted that Paul was acquitted around 63 or 64 AD. But then his aim was to go to Spain. We see that in Romans 15:28. We don't know if he made it, but tradition says he did. And it seems fairly certain that he was back in Greece or Asia Minor around 65 or 67 AD. That's modern-day Turkey, where he wrote Timothy and Titus. And it says that Paul was rearrested, taken back to Rome, and beheaded in 67 AD. Here's what I want you to know. Jesus and Paul preached the kingdom of God. The Lord is still inviting all to come into his kingdom. If you have not come to Christ by faith, then he knocks at your heart's door today and invites you to come in. I invite you to do that. Let's close in prayer. Father, we do thank you for this lesson. Father, we thank you for the life of Paul. And Father, what an example for Christians. Father, just be with us today as we continue in worship. Lord, just be with the speaker. May our hearts be attentive. And Father, may we glean from your word and apply it to our daily lives. Thank you, Lord, for all that you do for us.